This is the Evergreen Empire.
Green grow the forests and fair-clothed streams. The gentle deer grazes, the wild blossom gleams. From ocean wave raging to mountain serene, all nature's proclaiming our land's evergreen.
Welcome to Columbia Conversations. I'm Feliks Banel, editor of Columbia Magazine for the Washington State Historical Society. On this episode, we speak with Maggie Wetherbee, who recently joined the staff of the Washington State Historical Society.
Every time I was working in the collection, I was validating that stories like my family's exist, and they are important and they matter, and we need to make sure that they're preserved.
I spoke with Maggie Wetherbee by phone from where she's sheltering in place with family in eastern Washington. Maggie Wetherbee, thanks for joining us for this episode of Columbia Conversations. You're new to the staff there at the Washington State Historical Society. I understand you're the head of collections. You've just been on the job for how long at this point?
I have been on the job for a little more than a month. My first day actually was the day we got the news that we had to start working from home. So my first task was assigning telecommuting assignments to everyone who reports to me. So I have technically been on site at the museum for one day, and I've been telecommuting for the rest of the time.
Wow, what a strange way to start any new job, and especially a job related to history and collecting for the future. And there's so much I want to talk to you about, but I want to give you a chance to first tell us what you did before you came to the Washington State Historical Society, what other museums or where you worked or that sort of thing. So what were you doing most recently in terms of the museum or history field?
Great. I have been working in museums the last 15 years. My most recent post was actually coming in to help Fort Nisqually Living History Museum get ready for their initial accreditation. I worked to get their collection ready for that process. I was there very part-time on my schedule, and it was a wonderful experience. I can't recommend Fort Nisqually highly enough. We were successful in gaining our initial accreditation, and my tenure then ended because I was just there to help. Previously, I was the collections manager at the Japanese American National Museum in downtown Los Angeles in Little Tokyo, and I was in charge of all of the artifacts, the historic building, you name it. It's very similar to the role that I have just taken with the Washington State Historical Society. So I was there for 4 years and very happy in that position, but was ready to come back to Washington. I lived in the Los Angeles, Southern California area for 15 years before I came back to Washington.
And Maggie Wetherbee has a long family history in the Evergreen State.
I'm a fifth generation Washingtonian, and it's lovely to be back in my home state, really making sure that our history, where my roots are, is being preserved. And most of your listeners are probably wondering why I worked at the Japanese American National Museum, and it's part of my family story. My family came to Washington in any way possible. You know, we came across the covered wagons. We went by steamship around the Horn. Uh, we you every single aspect of how you could get to the state. My family did. Every side came early, and we're really fortunate because we have a really large collection of materials that they brought with them and writings that they did not only during their travels but as they settled here in Washington. And so I've sort of grown up with this amazing resource and was very interested in museums early on. I was really, it's actually kind of funny to me now, but my sixth grade class went on a field trip. We went to go watch some scientists dig up some Clovis points in East Wenatchee. So I really got to start thinking about museums and what they meant during that experience. It really popped up a lot of questions in the back of my head. Who studies these? Where do they go after they've been collected? And really, it was sort of the impetus for me going in the direction of the career that I chose. Um, So now I'm in charge of those. I'm in charge of the Clovis points that I watch come out of the ground
That's
as a
great.
sixth grader.
That's great. Did you grow up in Chelan County or that part of the state, or where did you go?
So my family has been, I have family all over the state, but my grandparents and great grandparents were all in Leavenworth. One of the old historic barns that's in all kinds of photos was my family barn. I grew up on the family ranch outside of Wenatchee for my formative kind of really early years, where I did everything from play in a cave with pictographs that was right behind my house to it was really common to walk along the river and find projectile points. Like these were just my childhood. Looking back now, it sounds super idyllic, but
Yeah.
that was my childhood. Then we moved. My dad had a well drilling business, and we moved to Pateros. Do you know where that is?
I spent a couple days in Pateros a few months ago. I was on a tour for Humanities Washington, giving
Uh huh.
talks all around that area, and I set up base camp at Pateros for a couple days and spent a lot of time there along that little waterfront park, taking breaks during the day.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a lovely little community right there where
Yes.
the Methow comes into the Columbia right there. Yeah.
Yes, right
Yeah.
there. So I went from third grade on, I went to school there, and Mrs. Wolf, who is now Mrs. Miller, was my teacher in sixth grade who took us on this amazing field trip to watch the Clovis points being taken out of the ground. And um, yeah, I'm a Eastern Washington small town girl who was really interested in history. I went to UW. I went and did a year abroad at the American University in Cairo in Egypt, where I was really fortunate to get to work with a Egyptology professor there who is in charge of the animal mummy rooms for the Cairo Museum.
Neat.
And from there, I went and did my master's degree in London. So I did my master's degree in museum studies with a specialization in collections management, which is what I do, at University College London. And I worked at the British Museum as part of that program in the ethnography department and also the education department. So I was also a museum educator early on. Early on. So
That's
I was
great.
really fortunate in my time there because I was able to work with lots of very progressive staff.
Maggie Wetherbee told me more about that progressive approach to artifacts.
They were very interested in making sure that families and cultural groups had access to collections in the ways that they needed to have them. For instance, there were certain groups who were allowed to come and have ceremonies with particular artifacts, and that really spoke to me as a girl from kind of rural Washington State who had a lot of interactions with lots of different types of people because on this side of the state, I'm actually currently self-quarantined on the eastern side. It was very interestingly mixed experience. I had Native American friends, I had African American friends, I had Latino friends. Right, everybody was very mixed, and I grew up with lots of friends who their grandparents were super important to them and they came to all of our games and they were these really important tribal members and I knew them as a grandmother who supported me, right? So coming back to Washington after this experience in England, where I really looked at museums and how they were having interactions with families and cultural groups. I came back and I compared it to amazing, amazing basket weavers who I know here, who work with the Smithsonian and other really large organizations. And it was interesting to me because I was really interested in, how did they learn to weave and what do they like to do when they have a weaving circle? Because the answers were so interesting. Um, they didn't remember learning how to weave because they'd always known how to do it.
Hmm.
And they love to watch Mariner games while they weave because, the boys in the tight pants. And the Smithsonian would do things like, well, we'd really like one of your baskets to come be part of our exhibition, but we would only like it if you would send it if it was this material, or if it was this theme, or if it was this design. And I thought that they were really missing the opportunity to really look at how these amazing weavers lived and how these amazing weavers, these baskets were part of them. They weren't just a something that they could send out, that they had their own room at the house because they were like children, and that they're missed when they're gone. And so that's always really stuck with me in my museum career. Just that notion of really making sure that we get stories right and that we are supportive of people and we listen to them while they're talking to us about artifacts, and we're listening to them while we keep good records at the museum. So that's really something that has followed me. And so in 1936, getting back to my family story, my aunt, my great aunt, who was born in Leavenworth, married a Nisei man, which it was a Japanese American man, first generation, and that was not done at the time. Um, and eventually, World War II breaks out, and they have to decide if she's going to go with him to Minidoka, or if she's going to try to stay and save the family farm that they were living on. So they have her stay at the farm, and he goes to Minidoka and he signs up to be a member of the 442nd, which is the all Japanese American unit that served in World War II. They're still the most highly decorated unit in the history of the military. They were sent on missions that no one was supposed to even survive. They were categorized as expendable. And so for me, working at the Japanese American National Museum not only combined I really want to get families and cultural groups into the collection about themselves, but it also really touched me in the sense that every time I was working in the collection, I was validating that that stories like my family's exist, and they are important and they matter, and we need to make sure that they're preserved. So I'm really excited to be joining the staff here at the Washington State Historical Society because I'm deeply rooted as a Washingtonian, but not only that, I bring lots of experience from lots of other places, and I'm happy to really come in and help in any way I can, share our stories and really make sure they're preserved well for the future. It's really, really, really what makes me excited about going to work every day, even though I'm doing it telecommuting right now.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that,
Homeschooling my children and
oh yeah,
all of that.
and that's kind of, I mean, that's the commonality I've found in the museum people that I've sort of liked the most, that I've had the most fun working with. There's got to be, there has to be, but there's often this personal connection where it's more than just taking care of, some artifacts on a shelf and making sure that the database reflects the right ownership and provenance and all that sort of thing. There's this other fire or passion to want to save these stories, and not just save them and keep them locked away in a cabinet or a room somewhere, but actually share them as well. And it feels to me, I was deputy director at Mohi in Seattle for about 7 years, and it seems to me just in that, and that's almost 20 years ago now, there's been this continued evolution of museums, and because of technology and because of being able for museums to actually share their own stories and tell their own stories without some intermediary, whether it's a newspaper or a television station or whatever, there's so much potential now and so much realization of potential to tell the kinds of stories that you've shared about yourself and about the other things that are hidden within the artifacts and within the photographs and the documents that are in the collection of the State Historical Society. And that sincere belief that everybody's story is valid and is useful and worth exploring is really great. And I remember when I was a little kid, museums were much simpler. Like 45 years ago, you'd go and they'd show you one of those old flat irons, and they'd talk about people, grandpa ironing people ironing their clothes. And the discussions have become so much more complex, and the appreciation for the complex relationships, like what you described with your family. That's great. You seem like it's a really good fit. One thing I wanted to ask you about, which you mentioned when you were first talking about being at Fort Nisqually, is this accreditation process. And I would guess that outside the museum world, very few people know what that is. And we went through it when I was at Mohi. We went through reaccreditation, 15, 20 years ago. But what's the short version of what accreditation is for a place like Fort Nisqually, and why it's important, and sort of why museums or institutions take the time to go through it?
That's a great question. And the American Alliance of Museums is the largest governing body for museums in the United States. And being an accredited museum with them means that you meet certain guidelines and you are very professional in your standards, and everything is in good order. And it's really helpful for getting things like grants and funding, but also just So you can attract better staff if you have accreditation. So it runs the gamut of value to the institution to go through this process. It's actually something I've done a lot in my career. And so it was very important for Fort Nisqually, who'd been working on this process for a really long time. I was just helping like be a closer for the project for them.
Hmm.
It's something they'd worked on for a really long time. And so for me to come in and just highlight things that we needed to change maybe or look at a different way before we go through the process, that was what I was able to do. And I have to say it was really fun because I got to just work on collections. And we made changes, and they went through the process very well and came out with accreditation, which was a very big deal because it's a first time thing for them, which means that they'd never been accredited before.
Yeah.
And then reaccreditation is every 10 years. You have to prove
Yeah.
that you're
Yeah.
still a professional institution.
And that seemed to me that we had to show that we were taking care of our artifacts properly, we were recognizing donors properly, all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed.
Yes,
Which,
it's a
yeah,
very thorough process.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Every department is very looked at and scrutinized and made sure. And this is something that the State Historical Society has just done itself. So it's something that a lot of institutions work toward and are working through.
All right. And now going back to your first day on the job and right before the closure and everything, I know in the meantime, it's been like 3 or 4 weeks, I've lost track myself, that the State Historical Society has been trying to actively collect and think about how they'll tell the story of this pandemic of 2020, what they'll need artifact-wise to be able to effectively tell that story in the future. So what has that meant for your job?
Yes, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. We were really looking internally at what we thought we needed to be actively collecting to try and help document this global pandemic. Looking back at the 1918 Spanish flu and the collection that we have for that, it's very minimal. There aren't a lot of artifacts to help us tell that story. We actually keep getting requests for artifacts, and we have photographs, and we do have a few things, but it is definitely an area that wasn't heavily collected because they were busy during this pandemic and not thinking about collections. So this is something that was really forefront in our minds. Like what do we need for future historians and our future selves to help tell this story in 100 years? Because that's how collections people think. We think in 100-year time frames. So really, we were having all of this internal dialogue, and collectively, we all started thinking that we really needed to ask people. We needed to ask people other than ourselves who are living through this global experience together, what types of things are important right now. And especially, we talked so much about stories just a bit ago about how museums always are interested in the stories of what are happening around. And for us, it's stories of Washington State. But right now, we're having this collective experience as Washingtonians. And we really need to ask people their stories. We really need to ask them to share what's important to them right now, or a meme they think that they can relate to, or pictures of their kids playing in the street at night because there are no people then. So they're not being in contact with anyone. We really need to have people have a way to share with us. So we left it very open and very broad on purpose to make sure that everyone who feels like they would like to participate can. There's no story or photo or whatever you would like to submit that is too small or too large for us to look at and to consider. And we've been really fortunate. We're getting really wonderful submissions. I was really motivated because I saw, like many moms, I am a mom. I have a group of Facebook moms that we all kind of talk amongst ourselves, share ideas, bounce things off of. And one of them is a nurse, and her daughter is 8, and she wrote a letter to her mom. And the letter was really wonderfully written. My mom is a nurse. My mom goes to work. My mom puts on her PPE. my mom keeps safe. My mom's a hero. So there was the shift in perspective of the child realizing that her mother is a nurse, but nurses are heroes because nurses are helping in a global pandemic. And when I saw that, I was just like, I need that. I I need to be able to figure out how to save that for scholars in 100 years because that's an important perspective, and it really helped to motivate me say 100%. Let's open this up to the public. Let's ask for what they're thinking. Let's ask for what they're feeling, and in whatever way that they would like us to have the information. And it's that we're having this collective experience together that is important to document, because you never know what the important pieces that we take away from this are going to be in 100 years. So the more we collect, the more stories we have, the more likelihood that we have those really important key pieces to preserve for perpetuity.
So are you actually collecting hard copies of things now, or is it all digital at this point?
Right now, we're actually collecting both, although we are not currently on site at the museum or the research center. So, what people are doing is if they'd like to donate something that is a physical artifact, they are emailing us about it and talking to us about what it is, and they're setting it aside, and we will get it from them after we're all sort of allowed back into the museum spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And we've received really amazing submissions of actual artifacts. The second thing we were offered was someone's essential worker letter, which is amazing, because that's a really key piece of history that I had to carry this letter with me to go to work because I'm an essential worker. And if I was stopped by the authorities, I could prove that I was allowed to be out and about. Um,
And there may not be a good answer for this question, but I've been thinking about this because, it seems like the experience around the United States and I guess other parts of the world as well, it's fairly similar. I mean, people are staying in their homes and working from home when they can or venturing out to get groceries or for the essential jobs they might be part of. Their kids are adapting. Um, are there artifacts or have you seen anything that's come in where you've said, okay, this artifact could only be collected in the evergreen state? This says pandemic 2020, but it also says only in Washington.
oh yeah, we my favorite example of that is really early on in the collecting process. We were offered a mask that was made by a lady named Debbie who lives in the Tri Cities. She made a mask out of a green Seahawks can cozy. It's amazing. It, it's amazing. And she also sent us the story of why she felt like she wanted to make it, and why when she saw the material, she thought she just wanted to give this a try. And she took what she saw and from a team she loved, and she adapted it to fit what she needed in that moment.
That's great.
And I think artifacts like that are going to be really, really valuable. And I mean, they're valuable now, but in 100 years, those are really going to be things that people can relate to
Yeah.
and
And
think, I am Washingtonian. I love that. And wow, look at what they did to
yeah,
adapt.
yeah, and especially when you have the story to go with it, because so many of the artifacts I would imagine from 1918, 1919, they're probably pretty cool on their own, and they probably stand up on their own. But I would guess we have nowhere near the backstory or the provenance or the kind of story behind the artifact that we'd have for pretty much everything that you're collecting this time around, right?
That is very true.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that's important for people to know who want to participate in the project is it's a conversation we want to have with you. We're happy to take your submissions, but we want to know more about you and what you're going through and what you're dealing with and what the story behind what you would like to give us is. Because it is such a key piece, and especially right now. And people are being very thoughtful with what they're submitting. We have had a 9-year-old boy named Gabriel who asked his mom if kids in the future would need to know what he was going through because he's keeping a journal and he thinks it might be important for them to know. So he would like to give us his COVID-19 journal. And that's amazing. That's a wonderful way that we can help preserve that story of his childhood experience.
Very nice. Well, Maggie Wetherbee, number one, congratulations on joining the staff there at the State Historical Society, and welcome aboard. It's great to have you. And thanks for taking the time to tell us about what you've been up to in your new job there at home and balancing everything the way so many people are trying to do in this very strange and unprecedented time. But thanks for being on this episode of Columbia Conversations.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to many more conversations.
Thank you to Maggie Wetherbee for speaking with me for this episode of Columbia Conversations from the Washington State Historical Society. If you have items you'd like to donate to the Washington State Historical Society's Pandemic Collection, search the web for Washington History Pandemic Collection. For more information about Columbia Magazine or to subscribe, please visit washingtonhistory.org. I'm Feliks Banel.